Okay, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 4th annual review of Macau gaming law. This is an event organized in the framework of the discipline of gaming law, which is offered in the International Business Law program in the Faculty of Law, University of Macau. For the last 3 years, we conducted this event at the University of Macau campus, always in the library building. This year it has been possible, thanks to the Rui Cunha Foundation, to organize it in this wonderful venue. We would like to express our thanks to the foundation for making this available, to Dr. Tubal Gonçalves, Dr. Rui Cunha, Dr. Filipa for the kindness and the extreme efficiency in putting this together. This event is co-chaired between the two of us, me and Professor Nelson Rose. Professor Nelson Rose needs no introduction. He has been teaching gaming law in this international business law program since the academic year of 2006-2007, and is extremely well known around the world as one of the world's leading experts in the field of gaming law, co-editor of the Gaming Law Review and Economics. Professor Rose recently just published the Gaming Law in a Nutshell, which you want to see, it looks like this. We are extremely excited to have you once again here and be able to share your experience, your knowledge with us. The last but not the least, of course, I should have a word of thanks for the foundation by itself in what it has been doing for the legal system of Macau. One of the initiatives that the foundation has decided to launch was the legal journal, which is over there, Legis Juris de Macau en Revista, which is bilingual, Chinese and Portuguese. And in fact, there are some gaming law pieces in those in issues number 1 and number 2, and hopefully more will come. So profit from this new publication, important legal publication in Macau. So what we will do is that we'll have our two presentations, and then we'll open for question and answer. We decided to reverse the order, and I'll go first and talk a little bit about the expansion of casino gaming in Asia and what Macau should do about it. It's a relatively simple presentation. It's a research interest that I've always wanted to accomplish, which was to provide an overview of what's happening around us. And finally, this is a first draft, first effort of this attempt at considering the context of Macau. Because, I mean, there is no secret at all about this. There is an expansion of gaming going on in Asia, that's totally clear. Macau helped start it, and then what Macau should do is really the question. So I will kind of make a circle, starting from Macau, then going around the region, not covering every possible jurisdiction, but the most important ones, and then coming back to Macau at the end, because the objective or purpose of this type of analysis is not to look at Asia as such. The starting point and the final issue is always what's the consequence for Macau how does this affect Macau, what Macau can do. Macau is always at the center of the concern, of the center of the research concerns and research interests, and I think that's in line with the purposes of the University of Macau and the purposes of the Rui Cunha Foundation. So let's start by very quickly having a little bit of background, although this we could spend a long time here. We don't have the time, that's not the purpose. So let's just say that the history of games of chance, and this presentation is only about games of chance, not about other forms of gambling. Let's say that the history of games of chance can be divided in three periods. One is the Fantan era, which started in 1849 when Governor Ferreira do Amaral legalized Fantan houses and went up all the way to 1961. In 62, it was the start of a period that lasted 40 years and 3 months of the exclusive concession to STDM. And then we have the current period. So Fantan was in fact for over 100 years the only game of chance offered, still played today, of course, and there is strong demand. This ended when Governor Silvério Marques took the initiative to actually change things, to introduce the concept of casino, because you can only talk about casinos in Macau starting from 1962, not before that. Before 62 there were Fantan houses, not casinos. And as everybody knows, two companies applied and STDM won the concession. The concession initially was not for such a long period, but it was renegotiated and extended a number of times until it finally expired on the 31st of March 2002. Then the transfer of sovereignty took place, and it was well known and widely expected that after the transfer of sovereignty, the gaming sector would change, and it did. It did under the new leadership, under the leadership of Chief Executive Edmund Ho and his team. Studies were initiated, legislation was prepared, and Law 16/2001 was enacted. A public tender was organized in late 2001, starting from November. The results were announced on 8th of February 2002, and as everybody knows, the winner of the tender was actually Wynn Resorts, Wynn Macau. Number 2 was a partnership between Galaxy and Las Vegas Sands, and number 3 was SJM. Then the situation evolved rather rapidly after that, because immediately a sub-concession came up in 2002 as a way of solving some practical problems that happened between the partners and of keeping them both in Macau. Then the 2 other concessions were authorized later, but I want to focus now on 2002 and on that period, because in reality the first operator, which was not SJM, to open its doors to the public, was in fact a sub-concessionaire. It was in fact the Venetian. And yesterday was the 10th anniversary of that moment. Behind that company is, as everybody knows, Sheldon Adelson, a visionary businessman who has done quite a lot of business activities throughout his life. He comes from tourism and trade shows, and then came into gambling. The other person that needs to be referred is Steve Wynn, who has been in the gaming industry all his life and is widely credited as having introduced major transformations in the Las Vegas Strip. So that's the moment, the historic moment 10 years ago, where competition effectively started. It was a moment, historic moment for many reasons, for economic reasons, for social reasons. It really was a paradigm shift. It showed to many persons how the new Macau could operate, how there was the possibility of a big market being developed. Pictures like this caught the attention of everybody, but certainly, among many others, they caught the attention of the financial markets. They caught the attention of the financial analysts, and there was a change in that. Before these periods, it was not so easy to obtain financing or to get access to stock market listing, but the different perception of the industry came up, as gaming is basically a form of entertainment, although of course complex, dangerous form of entertainment, but if tightly regulated and very well managed, can be offered, should be offered legally, and in a competitive market. The perception that this can be done in this manner, managed by corporations with highly professional executives at the helm of the companies, really made itself very visible in this period. So with this, the stock markets got interested, financing became widely available. I remember a conference which took place in the Old Mandarin Hotel, in which one of the speakers was Dr. Rui Cunha, which was packed. It was amazing, the army of financial analysts that suddenly came to town. That was really a transformation. With this, the understanding, of course, that there should be tight regulation, demanding regulation and supervision. And other jurisdictions took good note of what was happening. Other jurisdictions really paid a lot of attention to the developments of Macau. And the first jurisdiction that we should mention is, of course, Singapore. In 2005, to great surprise of just about everybody, Singapore announced a reversal of their long-standing policy against gambling. Singapore suddenly announced that they were going to legalize games of chance and have them operated in the city-state. The way Singapore has done it was by means of the concept of integrated resorts, a concept on which I want to say a few things more. Before that, let me say that, of course, Singapore planned this very carefully. They looked at the map, they looked at the physical locations available, and decided that they wanted to have two. One in a urban setting, in the financial center, in the city center, which became the Marina Bay Sands, and another in a more, well, properly what we usually say resort-style setting, with lower buildings, more of a family destination with theme parks and other entertainment clearly intended for families and other types of weekender groups. So this was done under the general idea of integrated resorts. Singapore really embraced this concept. And after Singapore came Japan. Japan, or is coming, apparently, Japan. Japan is now the next big jurisdiction that is going to come online. At the moment, legislation is pending. Legislation was introduced in December last year. It's in the Parliament now, and we're not very sure exactly how this thing is going to play out, but it seems that it may be possible to pass the legislation this year. Let me say a few more things about Japan. So, what is happening is clearly that Macau influenced Singapore, and Macau and Singapore together have been influencing Japan. The model or impact of the Marina Bay Sands is strong, and it seems relatively clear that the idea in Japan is to have something like the Marina Bay Sands, roughly speaking, of course, in various points of the country. There are other factors at play. There's a need to stimulate the economy, which, as everyone knows, has been a priority for the government of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And another factor is the hosting of the Olympic Games in Tokyo in 2020. So there is a sense that if Japan moves relatively quickly, it may be possible to have the integrated resorts in operation before 2020. That may seem a long time, but these things are complex. We're talking about passing the legislation, passing the regulations, organizing the tenders, decision making, then construction, approvals, execution, verifications. All of that takes plenty of time. And there may be problems down the road. There may be political problems which may stop the whole process, or other technical problems. It would be a missed opportunity, of course, for Japan if they would not finish on time for 2020. So we will see. But now it seems that things are moving after years and years of waiting and indecision. Because Japan is a country that has a culture of very broad consensus, and finding this consensus is not easy. Japan clearly is a market with an enormous potential. First of all, we're talking about the world's third largest economy. We're talking about a country where gaming and entertainment is part of the culture. I guess just about everybody has played with Japanese toys or forms of entertainment. As Professor Rose usually says, it's the last industrialized country without casinos. The country itself clearly has a large potential for tourism. Just that there's many reasons to visit Japan, and the reality is that Japan has not been getting a lot of tourists. The statistics indeed are low, and most analysts agree that the tourism in Japan could really improve if there were more reasons to visit the country. So the objectives are, let's say, the usual ones in this regard. Operation of very large projects with iconic impact to raise tourism visitation, expenditure, create jobs, increase taxes. These are objectives generally similar to most jurisdictions, although each one has a specific take. So, as I said, in Singapore, as in Japan, the concept underpinning these developments is that of integrated resort. What is an integrated resort? Well, like the name says, this is, tries to be a multifunctional offer. From the political point of view, the use of this concept is a way to promote consensus, because what is being said when the message being passed is that, well, what's happening here is not just gambling, or just gambling in a little way. In Singapore, the emphasis is that only 5% of the property is gambling. So the other 95% is other activities, such as conventions, shopping, etc. This is emphasized a lot in Singapore. Well, it's only 5%. It's only a little part. Gambling is not the main purpose. This is, of course, debatable, because at the end of the day, what you're saying is stressing an architectural point of view, is stressing that from the point of view of the building, a certain floor space is the casino and not more than that. But clearly that's just one possible angle, because what matters is probably not the point of view of architecture. What matters is the financial aspects, and there it's not going to be 5% of the revenue. It's going to be more. It's going to be a decisive issue. So those are the uses of this complex. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not. Of course, I agree with diversification. I think that these properties should really have entertainment for kids and other adults who don't want to gamble but may want to find other things to do within these properties. So it's for the legislator to actually shape the concept, defining what can be or what there should be in an integrated resort, and then beyond that, it's the imagination of the private sector. And in this manner, the word casino is avoided, which promotes consensus and facilitates the approval of this project. There can be a lot in an integrated resort. There can be conventions, there can be MICE industry, shopping malls, very large shopping malls with all the best brands in the world, shows and performances, very nice shows, wonderful ones, bars, nightclubs, live music, museums, exhibition, cultural centers, cinemas, for example, pools, beaches, spa, sauna, massage, gardens, aquariums, observatories, planetariums, whatever. All of this can be there, but the reality is that games of chance have to be there, and in fact for some gamblers all of this doesn't matter, because they want just to gamble, and the fact that it's within an integrated resort is not going to change that. Singapore discovered that. Of course there's all the social impact of gambling. Of course locals will gamble. These things are unavoidable, and the concept of integrated resort, while interesting, can never change that. What's going to happen in Japan is that looks like definitely there will be a big integrated resort in Tokyo and another one in Osaka. Probably two more will exist, one in the far north in Hokkaido, Sapporo, and one in the south in Okinawa. We're talking about building casinos in highly urban areas, in some of the most densely populated urban areas in the world, especially in Tokyo and Osaka. In Tokyo, what is being mentioned is the Odaiba area in the bay, near the sea, and not far from Haneda Airport. And in Osaka, something similar in Yumeshima Island, artificial island, close to Kansai Airport. This is the area that has been mentioned for Osaka, which is near the city center. And in Tokyo, it's probably going to be in this area, around this circle. So the center, downtown Tokyo, central Tokyo station is there. So there are quite a lot of aspects that need to be clarified by the legislator. I'm just going to mention some of them. This is the traditional list of issues that gaming law creates, and not even an exhaustive one. Of course, there'll be requirements for suitability and financial capacity of the operators. We will need to see whether there'll be concessions with deadlines and clear obligations for investment, like in Macau, or not. There will be questions about the constitutional structure of the Japanese state, because there will be the central government will have a role, plus the prefectures. So it's not clear exactly how this is going to work out. In terms of the public tenders, will there be various tenders at the same time for different integrated resorts around the country, or will they not take place at the same time? And maybe the criteria for decision making will be different. Another question that is being mentioned is whether there will be a need for partnerships between Japanese companies and foreign companies that are interested. The legislator may require that or not. If the legislator does not require, some companies may decide to apply alone, while others may decide to join forces with the companies, with Japanese companies. We will see. Just on Friday, I was watching on the news that just as an example, MGM was in talks with Sony and Panasonic, which obviously are from electronics and entertainment. So that's interesting. So you could imagine an integrated resort which would be very strong on entertainment, on electronic devices, gadgets, and so on. Why not? Why not? That's what I imagine from seeing an headline like that. So we'll see. But probably the strongest operators, or the ones who feel more confident about it, will go alone without joining forces. It's a tough decision for a company to do. There are other aspects that will need to be clarified. Taxation, most clearly. Whether there'll be limits on the growth of the industries, such as on the number of tables, which is Macau approach. Definitely, I think there will be some kind of exclusion programs to deal with compulsive gambling. In terms of the access, the entry and exit into the casinos, the question is whether there will be a check of identity of every person. I don't think there's going to be an entry fee like in Singapore. Just I would guess that will not happen. Because as you know, in Singapore, Singaporeans and local and foreign residents have to pay either 100 Singapore dollars for a 24-hour period, or 2,000 Singapore dollars for a whole year, which was supposed to create a barrier for locals, but actually, a bit to the surprise of the government, it didn't really happen because the Singaporeans are paying and coming and coming to gamble a lot. Other questions that will have to be solved is whether there'll be credit for gaming, what to do with gaming promoters, regulate them or not. There's the issue of smoking. Smoking in casinos. As you probably know, Japan has been, until a few years ago, one of the last bastions of smokers. All those things have been changing, but this is always a complex issue. Japan will need the rules for the prevention of money laundering. Well, that's not an option. That's totally necessary because it flows from international law obligations. So the only question is how exactly are the requirements going to be spelled out and implemented. In general, analysts are predicting a big success because this is a large country. I mean, it's a very long distance from Tokyo to Osaka, so this will be effectively regional monopolies. There are doubts about the ability to attract eye rollers from China, but the domestic market is probably so strong that that's not such a major concern. So, if Japan opens, who is probably going to suffer an impact is South Korea. Why? Because Korea has 17 casinos, 8 of them in the island of Jeju, but actually Koreans can only play at one of them, Gangwon Land Casino, which is the number 5 over there in this map. This is a very nice mountain area, but kind of quiet. There are now expansion plans going on in Incheon near the airport. That's clearly tourism oriented. But traditionally, most tourists were Japanese. But so if there will be casinos in Japan, things may have to change. A quick word about Russia. Russia changed the policy in 2009. Closed all casinos except in 4 authorized areas. For the purposes of our discussion here, I'll just mention that one of those areas is Vladivostok, near the provinces of Jilin and Heilongjiang, so about 2.5 hours flight from Beijing. Well, now there's going to be a 5th area, and it's, you guessed it, it's apparently going to be Crimea. Philippines has had gambling for quite some time, but there's a major expansion going on in recent years in Manila. There's an entertainment city coming up where various large resorts are being built. 2 of them have already opened. Moving on to Vietnam, there are 7 casinos for foreigners, 5 in the border with China, 1 in Da Nang in the center of the country, and another one in Ho Tram in the south, not extremely near Ho Chi Minh City. And I think I haven't been there, but I think the road is not extremely easy to get there. In Cambodia, gaming is operated by Naga Corp. Naga Corp has a license for 70 years with an exclusive within 200 kilometers until 2035. So Naga Corp is actually expanding at the moment. Second phase, very large second phase is going up. There are more than 30 casinos in the border with Thailand, such as in the towns of Poi Phet and Pai Lin, and in the border with Vietnam. The procedure is that the tourists come, for example, from Thailand. They pass the immigration controls of Thailand, and then they don't really need to pass the immigration controls of Cambodia, because the casinos are in the so-called no man's land. People can gamble and then return back. Taiwan has passed legislation in 2009, the Offshore Islands Development Act, whereby gambling is only in offshore islands. If the locals approve it in a referendum. The first referendum took place in Penghu Islands, Pescadores Islands, and everybody thought that the referendum was going to pass, but actually it didn't. The locals said, no, we don't want to have casinos here. This was a bit of a shock. The referendum may be repeated, but meanwhile there's been a referendum in Matsu Islands, which is the top group up there, and maybe if things go as planned, the first casino will be built there. Clearly, if situation stays like this, that means that's not a big concern for Macau. The big concern could be if there was casinos in Taipei City, and there are lobbies pushing for that. But so far, the policy is for regional development of the offshore islands, and unless there's a U-turn, this is going to be like that. Malaysia, as you know, is predominantly Islamic country, so you wouldn't expect casinos to exist, but actually there are. In the top of a mountain in the Genting Islands, 1,800 meters above sea level. It's very beautiful there, really nice place. Although it's a little bit difficult to get there, it's very high. The road is a very winding road, but it's worth it because it's a beautiful mountain resort. They are now undergoing an expansion or renovation. So we arrive back at Macau, where, as you know, there is massive construction going on. There's quite a lot of projects being built in the Cotai, and there's 20,000 hotel rooms coming online in the next few years. This will have an impact on the quality of life in Macau and some of those other topics that have been discussed in this room so often. There are needs for infrastructure, transportation. Macau will have more and more to deal with those problems that, as I said, the Rui Cunha Foundation has been doing a great job in raising discussion about those problems. So Macau is going to grow a lot, and after having grown so much, what can it do for the future? Can it, when the current concessions expire, is it possible to have new concessions with more building? It's difficult, in my opinion. Regional competition will mean that there will be more offer of gambling around Macau. But the fact that the bridge is going to come is going to facilitate coming to Macau, and probably if all the infrastructure is in place, Macau will continue to grow. Maybe not so fast, because it's not possible to grow so fast all the time, but there will be room for growth. I guess that the general idea that I would like to conclude with is that Macau will carry on, even with much more competition around the region. The city is going to become a more difficult place to live, that's clear. There's new reclamations coming. The city is expanding. There'll be more cars, there'll be more people, there'll be more tourists, more boats, more airplanes, more of everything. But if we do our homework properly, we should have no reason to concern with all that increased regional competition. Macau will continue to be the largest gaming jurisdiction in the world. The number 2 is Singapore at the moment. And in terms of Japan, the analysts say that Japan may immediately on year 1 or year 2 become the world's second largest, right behind Macau. But Macau also should not have anything to fear, I think, from Japan, because the domestic market in Japan is so large. Maybe VIP Japanese gamblers will not come so much to Macau, that's clear. But this will be compensated by the rise of a middle class that wants to travel, wants to come to Macau, wants to shop, wants to gamble. So the general idea is that there is increased regional competition. It will grow a lot in the next few years. Macau is going to withstand that, because the key assumptions for the success of gambling in Macau remain in place. They are not in the PowerPoint, but they're very clear. The key assumptions are the fact that there is no games of chance in mainland China since 1949, and there is no casino games of chance in Hong Kong since 1872, when they legalized Fan-Tan for a few years and then stopped it. If any of these assumptions was to change, that could be some reason for major concern, but we don't see that coming. Therefore, I think Macau is going to continue to grow. The problems that we have is our own work in terms of the quality of life and in terms of the structure of the city. So this is what I had to say about the expansion of casino gaming in Asia. And now I will pass the floor to Professor Rose. We need to change the PowerPoint.
Yep. That's it.
It's here, right?
I think so. Yeah. Terrific. Thank you, George. And I want to thank the University of Macau. I have been a visiting professor teaching gaming law with Professor George Godino now for many years. We must have both started when we were children, I think. And it's really been, to me, it's been amazing. I first came to Macau in 1986. And for those of you who were born then and remember it, the casinos were a lot different. In fact, thank you. I think one of the reasons that the Las Vegas Sands was so successful was they saw the potential where Harrah's didn't really bid on the concessions and ended up with the world's most expensive golf course, which they finally sold. But the potential, I have to say that I think my views have changed. I knew this was always a tremendous potential, but I thought there were just too many worries with a regulatory system that was both too old and too new. Too old in terms of we have these concessions with Macau is probably the only place in the world where they license the operators but not the casinos, and that every concession and sub-concession can have as many casinos as they want and as many partnerships as they want, which means if you're going to be somebody like the Las Vegas Sands getting into this market, you don't have originally 2 and now 5 concessions and sub-concessions as your competitors. You have a limitless number of competitors. And there are the problems of, with some of the laws in mainland China, mainly the problem of collectability of gambling debts, the restrictions on on getting currency out of the country, which has led to the junket operators, many of which would be not licensable anywhere else in the world. And I thought there was going to be a real worry. I thought there was going to be a worry, frankly, with the stability of the government of the PRC. And we actually have seen a little bit of that, not with the government, but in terms of, say, restricting tourists. One of the reasons Macau has boomed is because the law was changed in 2003, 2004, allowing mainlanders to travel as individuals rather than with groups. I was teaching gaming law a few years ago when all of a sudden the mainland government decided to close the border, in effect, by putting in the visa restrictions, right? Guangdong province, visitors could come only once a month, or once every 2 months, once every 3 months. I had a student whose job was in the frequent visitor program, frequent gambler program at one of the Macau casinos. She lost her job because there weren't frequent gamblers. I think my view has changed. I think obviously there can always be something happening on the mainland which could affect Macau, but having looked at their plans for regional developments with the idea that Macau is going to be part of an entire region of China, which very long-term planning, I don't see any fundamental change in the policy of Beijing, the policy of the PRC, saying, you know, we don't like gambling, maybe we made a mistake. Just the opposite. I think that they decided that tourism is a fundamental driving force for the economy. And right now, Macau gets most of its patrons from the south and southeastern part of China. When the bullet trains are finally completed, you have the Beijing market opening up more. And the competition, as George showed, is not going to be tremendously, it's not going to be that harmful for Macau. What I want to focus on, though, is what I was asked to focus on is the U.S. Legal influence and the problem that creates for the companies that are here and Macau itself. And I think the way to put this in focus is you have to remember what this industry is. Gambling is what I call a morally suspect industry. It used to be a vice. It used to be a sin, in fact, and it clearly was illegal. It's still illegal in almost all parts of the world. In fact, even in places like Macau and Nevada, it's clearly illegal if you don't have a license. And what a license does, and I think it's very important to realize this, a license doesn't mean that you are all of a sudden a 100% legitimate company, that you're just like selling shoes. Instead, what a license means is you can do things that other people would get arrested for doing, but you can do them. That's what your license allows you to do. And the history of being this morally suspect industry with a very bad history of infiltration by organized crime means that it's an industry that becomes very heavily regulated with restrictions that would just be impossible to see on any other business, like restrictions on the right to advertise. It's still a crime in People's Republic of China to advertise gambling, which is a little bizarre considering you have the largest casino jurisdiction in the world as part of China and the largest racing jurisdiction with the Hong Kong Jockey Club as part of China. But the idea that, as of 30 years ago, you could actually get the death penalty for gambling is bizarre. It still is actually just gambling on the mainland can subject you to a couple weeks of hard labor. Advertising it is worse. It's actually a crime. That helps explain a lot of the reason why the law in this area is so weird and why we end up with, it helps explain a lot of the conflicts that are going on between American law and what's going on in Macau. Just to explicitly state what we all know, but sometimes it helps to step back, which is the law is slow while changes in society can be very fast, particularly changes based on technology. So the law reacts to changes in society. People don't sit around and say, legislators don't meet and say, gee, if someone invents the internet, what should we do about it? Instead, you end up with the internet and gambling being invented, and then the legislature reacts. And what they usually react to is what I call the paradigm case. If you look at the laws, for example, that describe what is a slot machine in American federal law, it actually said, the first version in 1952 said it has a handle, and when you pull it, reels go around, and it takes coins and pays coins. Well, that's what a slot machine was. If you describe a slot machine that way, of course, operators will then say, well, let's eliminate the handle and put in a button, or have the bartender pay off. We still have that idea. I think one of the things that happened with Macau, when they decided that there shouldn't be a monopoly, we should have 3 concessions, the vision was, we'll have casinos like the ones that exist in Macau, except they'll now have some Americans and other people involved with ownership. They never really thought that somebody was going to come in, spend $1 billion and build what I think is the Venetian, I think is the 3rd largest building in the world in square footage. That vision wasn't there. The paradigm case was, we're going to end up with some more fairly small casinos. And the law has to figure out a way to catch up with that. One of the things that's very important, particularly given this history of being a morally suspect industry, is to realize that the laws are made by politicians and, of course, by voters when they have a say. They're not, particularly in places like the United States, you don't have a group of scientists study the issue and say, this is what we should do. Instead, it's more, well, my gut feeling says casinos are dangerous, but they seem to be okay. So why don't we do it? But let's put some restrictions in, like they can't advertise, or bets will be limited to $5. My favorite, actually, is that in a couple of states, the United States, they are required to be on riverboats. That means they're required to float on water. Only the riverboats aren't allowed to have engines or crews. So they float, they dig a big hole in the ground and they build a floating casino on it and pump in water from the nearby river so they can call it a riverboat. Okay, that's, that. Or another good one was, because gambling is so dangerous, we're going to only allow people to gamble for 4 hours. That was actually the law in Iowa, which means, and it's got to be a riverboat. Now, these were real riverboats. The people got on board the boat, it pulled away from the shore a few feet, and then they closed the doors, of course, and it didn't go anywhere. The water was going, like 3 kilometers an hour south, so the boat would go 3 kilometers an hour north, and it would stay in one place with muddy water, trees that were 30 feet high, so you couldn't see anything, and there wasn't anything else to do. Think about this brilliant idea. The whole point was, we're not going to have gambling as the main purpose. It's going to be tourism. So let's lock compulsive gamblers into a casino for 4 hours with nothing else to do. What finally happened, actually, was winter hit, and the rivers freeze, so the boats couldn't even move. But they closed the doors, and people were locked into this casino for 4 hours. Well, somebody got sick, and he had to go to the hospital. And they said, I'm sorry, we're cruising. And fortunately, the manager of the casino said, no, we're not. Open the door and take him to the hospital. And after that, they said, gee, maybe we should allow people to come in and off, Part of this, because the law follows history, we need to know the history. And I focus, obviously, in the United States because that's where I'm from, but it happens pretty much around the world. Gambling comes and goes in great waves. It's legal everywhere. Then it seems that there's big scandals, a reawakened conservative morality kicks in, and then it's all outlawed again. So if you go through this is a quick history of both the US and Canada, where this is the third time. This is what I call the third wave of legal gambling. Third time in American history that gambling has spread everywhere. The important thing to understand is that, and this is sometimes hard, it shouldn't be hard, but it's hard for people in Macau to understand, that gambling is a state issue, not a federal issue. And people in Macau should realize that, because Macau is part of the People's Republic of China, but obviously has different laws. And Hong Kong has different laws, until 2049 at least, which we can get to on the question of concessions. But so the laws are made state by state, just like Macau and Hong Kong have different laws. To show you very dramatically what this spread of gambling looks like, I did the state lotteries. 1961, the states in red are the states with lotteries. There are none. Then what happened is the little state of New Hampshire rediscovered the state lotteries. They'd all been outlawed. And they thought they would make so much money they wouldn't have to impose an income tax. Well, it didn't work. But 80% of their customers came from New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So New York was second. That didn't work. Then New Jersey was third, and they got it right. Rather than have people fill out a form and have 2 drawings a year, it was $1, you get a ticket. The drawings were once a week, once a day, every 5 minutes, instant. And then notice that what happens when you have a breakthrough, like the state of Florida legalizes a state lottery, and the neighboring states say, you know, Florida didn't break off and float out into the Atlantic and sink. Their state lotteries seem to be pretty successful. So Georgia, the nearby state, saw all that money going out of state, so they said, we have to legalize it. I had the map freeze right here because to reinforce the idea that the legalization of gambling is a political issue. It's not a legal issue. It's made by politicians. In 1998, there were elections in the United States, and the Republicans swept everything, with 2 exceptions. The Republican governor of South Carolina, the Republican governor of Alabama, they were running for re-election on the idea of continuing what they were doing, while the Democrats said, we need state lotteries. We need to figure out a way to raise money for education. Both of those governors were defeated, which meant, of course, we're going to have state lotteries. It didn't happen. In a special election in 1999, they had an election in Alabama, and all of the religious groups from all of the southern part of the United States poured into Alabama to talk about the evils of legal gambling. They were funded by casinos in Mississippi that didn't want the competition. After that, though, the world got back to the normal trend. And what you're seeing going on, as George described it with casinos, in Asia, it's what's going on everywhere in the world. This is where we are today in the United States, with half a dozen states that don't have lotteries. And look at the ones that don't. Nevada, what a surprise. There was a bill to legalize a state lottery in Nevada, and the only place you could buy lottery tickets would be casinos. The casinos then said, nah, we don't even want to take a chance with that. So they don't even have they still don't have a state lottery. Mississippi, which is the second largest casino state, doesn't have a lottery. Utah's probably the only one that, for religious reasons, actually doesn't have any gambling. To show you the massive expansion that you're going to see in Asia as well, this is a typical state in the United States, and let's see if you can guess which one. It's got casinos, a state lottery, lots of racetracks. In fact, they actually allowed betting on sports events, which is very rare. Anybody have any guess? It's not Nevada. Nevada doesn't have a lottery, remember. This is the state of Oregon. Nobody ever thinks of Oregon as, you know, this great center of hedonism and sin. It's just a typical state. But there's so much gambling that it's become more and more accepted and acceptable. What we've seen, this is the change that's going on. 300 years ago, gambling was seen as a sin. You literally couldn't even write a rule book about it because it just was not a proper subject for study. Then the law changed and it became merely a vice. The difference is, if it's a sin, you can't do anything with it. If it's a vice, you can, for example, allow it in the middle of the desert in Las Vegas, put it in a riverboat, surrounded by holy water, so it's sanitized. This is the view of China, by the way. Okay, we're going to have gambling, but it's only going to be in Macau and at the racetrack in Hong Kong. If you ask people on the mainland, do you have any gambling? They say no. And I said, but you've got like 2 two of the world's largest lotteries. Oh, that's lotteries, that's not gambling. I don't know what it is then. Once it becomes, and this is the modern view, led by the state lotteries, by the way, but clearly promoted by casinos, and particularly casinos in Macau, that it's merely another form of entertainment. If that is true, then the law has to change with that, which means you can actively promote it. You can advertise. You don't have to put it on a mountaintop or a riverboat surrounded by holy water. It can start going into people's homes through the internet. For the United States, again, I want to emphasize that it's a state issue, which means that for the operators who are here, their main concern is the states where they're licensed. So the best example is what happened with MGM and Pansy Ho. Now the MGM has casinos in Nevada. It had a casino in New Jersey, in Atlantic City. So it was subject to the laws of those two states. Las Vegas Sands right now also has a casino in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So there have always been a lot of rumors that Las Vegas Sands will be selling that casino so they don't have to worry about Pennsylvania anymore. The latest word was no, they're not going to sell it. I think they eventually will. Because if you're making so much more money from China, why do you have to worry about the state of Pennsylvania? As MGM found out, Nevada and New Jersey had the exact same information about Pansy Ho being a partner with MGM. They decided completely differently. Nobody has even alleged that Pansy Ho was involved in anything illegal or had any problems. But her father is Stanley Ho. And Stanley Ho gave her like $80 million to help invest in the partnership with MGM. Both Nevada and New Jersey decided, again, with no convictions, criminal convictions, but they decided they didn't like Stanley Ho. What Nevada said was, well, if Stanley Ho ever looks like he's going to influence Pansy Ho, then we'll take the license away. New Jersey said, nobody, even a billionaire, gives their daughter $80 million without strings attached. Therefore, you've got your choice, MGM. You either cut your ties with Pansy Ho, or you have to give up the casino. You have to choose between Atlantic City and China. And MGM chose China. Now they're trying to get back in. But you can see why it's the states that have decided what is going to happen in Macau, which seems really weird, but it's because they have to protect their state licenses, unless they want to give it up. Steve Wynn doesn't have a casino in New Jersey, so he doesn't care what New Jersey says. So it's a state issue unless it isn't. The federal government does not normally get involved in the control of gambling. When it does, it's for political reasons. I testified last summer in front of a commission which was actually created by the United States Congress called the U.S.-China, and then it had a long name about social economic impact. And in fact, I'm afraid I may be the person who was kind of responsible for the new restrictions on the use of credit cards and the crackdown on the jewelry stores, because I testified about, well, here's how people on the mainland get their money out when they're not allowed to get their currency out. One thing I saw, George and I we were visiting a bunch of casino floors, and we stopped in and saw right on the casino floor a jewelry store. And I just stood there and watched. And what we saw was somebody come up, give a credit card, supposedly buy a watch. There was no watch involved. Instead, there was a big wad of cash that the guy got. And then he got his cash and left. So it was clear what was going on was they were pretending that they were selling a watch, but it actually was a way to get cash out. I talked to some insiders, by the way, about, because I had assumed, let's say the player wins. I thought what would happen, let's say he gets $100,000 Hong Kong in cash, and he wins. I thought he would take the cash, go back to the jewelry store, pay back the loan, and have the credit card receipt torn up. And I was informed, no, that's not what happens, because so many people make money and the interest rates they're getting are so high that they don't want the player to pay back too fast. In fact, they're hoping they'll lose so that maybe they can borrow some more money. The federal government of the United States is putting restrictions. Yes, they do have a concern about money laundering. There's a rumor that the Treasury, FinCEN, is proposing regulations that casinos have to find out the source of high rollers' money, which would be really bizarre. I mean, if you buy a yacht, the person who's selling the yacht doesn't say, gee, where'd you get your money? But this at least is a rumor that they're looking it over. They're certainly concerned about money laundering. I don't think that's their main motivation. I think the main motivation is the United States federal government is scared about China. They're constantly worried about China. And we all know the reasons, because China has so much of the U.S. Treasury notes. China is the main potential competitor for economic growth. Of course, Russia has the Crimea now, so, but like President Barack Obama dismissed Russia as being much of a threat. He doesn't dismiss China. And so when the U.S. companies start getting involved in Chinese businesses, the federal government gets involved. But again, you have to understand what's going on. The same hearing I testified at on what is going on in Macau for this commission which was created by Congress. The same hearing, they then, after us, had a panel on the crackdown of political dissidents in Hong Kong. Right? Nothing to do with gambling in Macau. It's the federal government's view of China. Well, okay, gee, there's this gambling, which means there must be money laundering. Oh, and meanwhile in Hong Kong, they're cracking down on political dissidents. I mean, this is the U.S. government's view of China. One thing that I think we are going to see, and it's only beginning to come to Asia now, is there's another big issue, which we don't have time really to discuss, but where gambling has changed from being seen as a sin to still the predominant view around the world is gambling is a vice. Therefore, there's restrictions on the right to advertise, on the collectability, enforceability of contracts. It's becoming seen as a form of entertainment. The American Psychiatric Association in 1980 declared pathological gambling an official mental disease or disorder. What that means is we now have another big trend. If you gamble to excess, what happens to you? Well, if you gamble to excess, because when gambling is a sin, you are a sinner, which means you go to hell, literally. Fire, brimstones, the devil, I mean, you go to hell. It's not our problem, we feel sorry for your family, but too bad. The predominant view is gambling is a vice, which means if you gamble to excess, it's your own problem. You're morally weak, you've given in to your urges, and we're not going to excuse you, but at least maybe we'll take care of the family. Once gambling was described as an official disease, the law has to change. We don't punish people for being sick. What we do is try to treat them. So if, in fact, gambling is to excess is merely a disease, then it's got all sorts of ramification. My favorite case on this is there was a divorce case where the husband was a compulsive gambler. He lost all the family money. The wife, they finally get divorced. The wife gets what little bit of money is left. She gets what we used to call alimony, now we call spousal support. She gets help from the husband so she can go back in the job market. Goes up on appeal. Court of Appeal says, no, no, no. He's a compulsive gambler. He's sick. She has to give him money so he can be cured and treated. Well, that makes sense if gambling to excess is a disease. I want to finish with this, looking at the tremendous changes that are going on. And then maybe during the question and answer, I'll give you my views on the concession renewals. But remembering that gambling is this morally suspect industry, it's got this history, and that's the reason the laws are so strange. But we also saw that gambling has spread everywhere. It's virtually in every jurisdiction in the world, which means it can't be that bad. I mean, we're talking legal. It's not necessarily illegal gambling's everywhere, but legal gambling's everywhere. This is a Forbes magazine cover from 1996. The interesting thing about it was they decided to do a cover story on people who are making more than $1 million a year, 1996 dollars, that weren't in typical business. What they didn't, nowhere in the article did they mention, 2 of them make their money from gambling. This Indian chief happens to be the head of the tribe that has the largest casino in the United States, Foxwoods. The guy above him is a professional poker player. Gambling has become so accepted and so just normal that they didn't feel it was necessary to even mention the fact that they were making their money from gambling. So I think what we're going to see is more and more of gambling simply being another part of life, which means you are going to eventually have to have some changes in, for example, the restrictions on advertising in China, the collectability of gambling debt. They don't seem to be doing much good, and laws like that are not doing good, and they're creating harm. So with that, I want to thank you again. I want to thank the Rui Cunha Institute and the University of Macau for inviting me, and thank you all for coming, and we can throw it open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rose, for your very interesting presentation, which really highlights the interdisciplinarity of these topics. We've talked about history, we've talked about politics, we've talked about regulation, licensing, and and of course we know that the U.S. government is always worried about the rest of the world, really, not just China, and how these things then play out, such as through the money laundering field. In Macau, as a matter of fact, we're sometimes puzzled about issues that we read in the newspapers, because we realize that sometimes things are mentioned in the press. We wonder if this is just for domestic consumption, and we could even get into the politics, right, in terms of party politics, of how these things move on. Maybe we can get there in the question and answer session. So, at this point, we would like to open for whatever comments, observations, questions, clarification requests. Paul, please.
Yeah.
I think there's a microphone. Here we go.
Curious about the situation in India and Brazil. Any possibility there's a quick update on it?
India has casinos in Goa, And as far as I understand, I try to keep track of most jurisdictions, but as far as I understand, the situation is relatively stable. Where there has been quite a lot of news that there could be an expansion of gaming is actually in Sri Lanka. In Brazil, as far as I understand, the religious groups are quite strong, and of course it's another major country without casinos. They were started in the 1920s, the famous Copacabana Palace, and then they were closed down in the 1940s, and it stayed like that. I don't anticipate changes in Brazil, or at least there's no news in this respect.
And by the way, I forgot to put in a plug for the Gaming Law Review and Economics, which I'm the co-editor-in-chief. If we're always looking for contributors, and so if you get anything interesting that might not be available, such as a complaint that's filed in a lawsuit, and we've run some interesting stuff, and it's published. Our turnaround time is very fast. Also, I do a monthly column, and if anyone is interested in getting that, it's just send me an email. It's Rose, R-O-S-E, at sprintmail.com, SPRINTMAIL. I have a lot of columns. It's also, you can get me through the website, gamblingandthelaw.com. I haven't written on India. The thing that George and I were talking about India before we this afternoon, and I think India is a good example of showing how geographic proximity makes a difference. Who would have thought that Singapore would have legalized? But Singapore is fairly near Macau, and is certainly fairly near the Philippines and other areas and Australia, other areas that have casinos. Southern Asia, India just doesn't have that much. Besides Goa, it was Sikkim, and there doesn't seem to be that pressure of seeing the money going out of the country across the line. I did write about Latin America, and the two big prizes that are left are Brazil and Venezuela. Brazil's flip-flops, I don't see much going on. I think there will be a change in Venezuela now that Chavez is gone. The more interesting one to me was I got to go to Cuba last January, and Cuba is definitely going to have some major political changes. We don't know if it's going to be slow or fast. We don't know if it's going to be violent or nonviolent. But the Castro brothers were very effective at making sure they had no competitors. And all the old men from the 1959 revolution are dying, and there are no replacements. The country is desperate. Lawyers make, and of course that's what I looked at, lawyers make $40 a month. I ran into one nuclear physicist who was driving a taxi because he could make more driving a taxi than $30 a month he could make as a nuclear physicist. So, and Cuba had casinos. In fact, the casinos are still standing. I actually met with a government official, and I said, I think you should follow Macau and open it up again. And they thought I was crazy. Well, we'll see 10 years from now, what will happen. But definitely the other parts of the world are catching up. The other thing to watch for is technology. I think hard to tell, but certainly in 20 years, the casinos in Macau will not have a lot of table games, and they won't even have slot machines. The same thing's happening in the U.S. people who play games on the internet, who are walking around with the very best games that were ever invented in their pocket, don't want to go in the building, into a building the size of a warehouse to stand in front of a metal box and press a button and watch reels go around. What is going to happen is technology is changing, and this is already beginning, where you get, say, a dedicated iPad. That's your slot machine. And you can go to a sports bar. Now, it's happening in the U.S. It's not happening so much here, partly because you're introducing people to legal gambling who didn't have it. But I think you're going to find, particularly with restrictions on the number of table games, you're going to find more and more machines, and the machines are going to get better and better. People in their 20s and 30s, don't particularly like slot machines. They don't even particularly like table games. What they want is games that are much more interesting, that are faster. And once the regulators figure out a way to deal with that, I think you're going to find tremendous changes happening here and everywhere. And actually, the reason I brought that up is because the machines are sweeping Latin America right now. Even countries that don't technically have casinos, they may call them amusement halls or something like that, but they may call them bingo machines, but they're getting more and more interesting.
Yeah, sure. Brazil, there was a lot of bingos.
Bingo, yeah.
But in reality, this was slot machines for all purposes. There's a question here. There's a microphone.
Good afternoon, professors. Thank you very much. I've been recently, actually last week, in Tokyo for a Japan Gaming Congress. Well, it was interesting to see the will that Japanese authorities and that the worldwide gaming industry is having to go for Japan. From my professional point of view, and as a Macau professional, as a Macau lawyer related with gaming activity, I got a bit disappointed because I realized that the world industry doesn't support Macau way of operations. I mean, Macau still, and it will probably, as you said, continue as the world biggest market for this specific activity. But the target and the model to copy for Japan is always, the quoted model was always Singapore. Either with the kind of eye on developments they made there, or either because they're strong commitment against junkets,
right,
or any other kind of similar operations in Macau. What do you think Macau could do to improve its image especially with regard to the US, for instance, or with Japan, or any other, or even Singapore, for instance?
You want to
go?
Well, I do think there is an image problem. And to some extent, it's the same image problem that the U.S. had in the 1950s. There was the big book was Greenfelt Jungle, which I think was written around 1958. And one of the theses in the book was that literally every casino in Las Vegas was infiltrated by the mob, with maybe one or two exceptions. The change came about actually when, and a part of this again is that historical background, the morally suspect industry, infiltration by organized crime, and what are we going to do about it? So every owner has to be licensed, everybody involved. In the 1960s, Howard Hughes came in. And everybody thought Howard Hughes was a genius. You know, we didn't know that he walked around with his boxes, with his feet in tissue boxes and stuff. But they changed the law so that corporations could own casinos. That also opened the door to legitimate financing. And of course, they also started getting more and more regulatory control. There, in the U.S., it was mainly they were afraid the federal government might come in and close things down. I think what has happened to Macau is the impact of those states, like Nevada and New Jersey, telling their licensed casinos, you can't do business in Macau unless things are straightened up more, has forced some changes. Singapore is forcing changes. I talked to one of the head regulators about 3 weeks ago, and I said I had heard that not a single junket operator who had been approved by Macau had been approved by Singapore, and he sat and thought and says, yes, that's right. Now, they are doing junkets, and the junket operators, I think the entire system in Macau is getting better and better. I think it's getting tougher. I think the market itself is forcing some of the weaker operators out, some of the bad guys out. I don't know how you change it. It took Nevada 40 years to change their image, and their image hasn't changed that much. Right now, there was just a big article that Nevada's a swing state. The Republican Party, Las Vegas is trying to get the Republican Party National Convention in 2016 in Nevada, and they don't think they're going to get it because Nevada has an image that the Republican Party think, nah, we don't really want to be in Nevada, Sin City, in Las Vegas. So I think all you can do is work on having strict laws, having, strict enforcement of the laws, and over time, the image, I think, gets better and better. But I don't think there's any short-term fixes.
I'll have a slightly different take on the question. First of all, if Japan chooses to copy, roughly speaking, Singapore, that's fine. In gaming law, there are many different ways of doing this, with different priorities in terms of taxation, market structure, you name it. So that Japan is choosing to select Singapore, I think, is kind of natural when you consider that the legal and regulatory culture of the two countries is quite similar. Both of them have a certain preference for extremely strict and disciplined and tight regulation. Because when you look around in gaming, there are many other ways of doing it, such as the Philippines. We have a public operator, which is, for example, totally out of our culture here in Macau. That has never happened in Macau, having a public operation. It's always been the private sector. So what can Macau do in this context? It's not easy. I guess my answer is to have better information about what is happening. Because when the information is not clear, there is manipulation for political purposes in other places. If it's dark, even if there's nothing going on, there is room to talk about it and to use it. But if the facts are clear, it's not so easy. So I've been saying that there should be probably more information. There should be perhaps an annual report put out by the government, by the regulator. For example, Singapore has done one thing which is interesting. Whenever there's an enforcement action, it's publicly available on the website of the CRA, the Casino Regulatory Authority of Singapore. There has been disciplinary action against Marina Bay Sands or Resorts World because they allowed Singaporeans to stay more than 24 hours, or they allowed people who were not 21 years old to come in and they were not checking properly. It's there. It's clear. And they were fined and so on. And people, the public knows how the system is actually working. I think this is extremely important because it dispels rumors and transparency in a field which has this complex nature that we're talking about, which, with apologies to the journalists that may be in the room, but journalists love these stories and thrive on these things. And stories get repeated, but when there's a story which is correct, then it's slightly changed in the next round and the next round, and this happened. Has been happening a lot in relation to Macau stories. So transparency is information is all about image management, and I think there is room for improvement.
Yeah, and I have to say the image management is somewhat beyond the control of any of us. I don't know what we can do. Think about, when I say that illegal gambling is a morally suspect industry, we used to call those victimless crimes, only it's legal and is being promoted. But we all have an image of it. Because think of how strange it is that Singapore became one of the first nations to really have these giant casinos. Or it seems so weird that Russia would have this, annex part of the Ukraine, Crimea, and what did they announce? That they're going to put in casinos. I mean, because we all have this view that just seems like a very strange, I guess that really means you're part of the country. But because of the image, Singapore will go around saying, we don't have casinos, we have integrated resorts. Tokyo, is going to say the same thing. Iowa has riverboats for tourism, and then they just lock people into the casinos. I don't think Macau can do anything about that. You can't all of a sudden, you can try and say you have integrated resorts, but I know many of the entertainment complexes that were built near the casinos haven't been successful. Nevada went through the same thing. 20 years ago, Las Vegas decided it was going to become family-oriented and open up amusement parks. Well, first of all, just because you know how to run a casino doesn't mean that you know how to run an amusement park. Secondly, they forgot, what do you do with the kids when the amusement parks are closed? I mean, it was a disaster. The amusement parks, it didn't work. Las Vegas, even with beautiful, weird buildings, is still basically built around bringing in people for adult activities. Macau is built around bringing in people for adult activities, mainly for gambling. Singapore simply declared that it was not going to be doing that. It doesn't mean that that's not what's going on, but they managed to simply declare, this is going to be our image. We're doing integrated resorts, and let's ignore the fact that they're dependent on the casinos for the financing. Tokyo will do the same, Japan will do the same thing. I think it's again, only with time and only as the image of gambling becomes more and more just another part of society that that image will change, and it certainly will not change for everyone.
Paul?
Could you give a little more development on the Indian situation? You mentioned Goa, which seems to suggest it's restricted just to Goa.
I have selected my jurisdictions on the basis of possible impact on Macau. In India, you're really actually relatively far in terms of flight time, and I wouldn't go much more into India in that respect.
Although I do think the University of Macau always puts me up at the Regency, which I do not recommend as a hotel, but it is within walking distance, it's very close. And when the Las Vegas Sands had the Bollywood Awards like 5 or 6 years ago, there were, for the first time, I was seeing extremely wealthy Indians all over Macau. Now, at this hotel, there are middle class Indians. There's clearly a whole tour groups have, and I know that Macau and Singapore are fighting for that population, which does have, hundreds of millions of people who could afford to come and gamble. As a coincidence, my daughter and her fiance are there right now for 4.5 months, and I told her to stop in Goa, and so I've been following it, and there's some developments, but they are still, this is like the extreme example of the image. They want to pretend they don't have casinos, or at least, okay, we're going to limit it to the old Portuguese colony, and I think they're going to be a long time coming. Where the breakthrough is coming with India is actually internet gambling, that they are about to change and to really allow it. And I don't know if it's going to be state by state or nationwide or how much it will be, but I think they view internet gaming different from land-based casinos. So I think that's going to be a change.
Can you just clarify a bit? The regulations for Goa are state regulations of Goa, or are they national regulations?
They're state, yeah. Goa and Sikkim are the only, and Sikkim's really independent. Goa is the only part that presently has casinos, and I believe they must all be on riverboats or whatever, floating. Now, there is another Portuguese colony that is technically not Goa, but very close, that has announced that it's also going to have casinos. Again, it's really pretty small and far away from the population centers of the country.
One last question.
Good evening.
I'm glad to hear again the lesson that last year and before I had a chance. Thank you. And the example that you gave of the so-called incident with MGM and Expensive,
Yeah.
take me to think how different countries are interfering on others. And while it was only restricted to Vegas, Las Vegas is a mecca of gambling, and Macau is a small territory that not even have capacity to act on foreign relations, things could be more easy. But as Professor Rubinho just mentioned and showed on the map, now coming into the game, big players.
Yes.
Japan is a country, well, about third economy on the world. Then come the Philippines. Then comes Singapore, Vietnam. So what it was up to now, something restricted for companies, corporate problems, may develop into countries' problems.
Yes.
And then this will be liaised immediately to political interest. Not only money, not only just a matter of practices of, I would ask, in this case, once that the problems now may change from just simple corporate problems to country problems, and once also there is a concern on all countries that the companies allowed on their countries, whenever they go to other jurisdiction, they must follow the regulators, their own regulators'
Right.
instructions. It's not time for thinking for something that is more global, like the WTO. regulate the commerce in the world. Was very difficult, had a very stormy times, but anyhow, there are some rules to avoid what may happen, that the more strong economy, like the States, be acting as colonialist for the other small jurisdiction. And then they can create rules inside that can affect the freedom
Yes.
of the other jurisdiction to have their law. Let's put a very silly idea. For instance, they in states they make that from now on, that American companies who have business on the gambling on other countries cannot accept any currency other than US dollar.
Right.
For instance, this is an example, but in that case, all the other jurisdictions where it happened that those American companies are settled already, are controlling already the gambling on those small jurisdictions, they will be affected because the government of those jurisdictions will have to follow it because they need it. So you don't think that it's time to think on a global regulation, a body that can put some rules to avoid what we can call an abuse of the strongest over the small jurisdiction? Thank you.
I understand the question and the sentiment, but I think it's not going to happen. What does seem to be the impact, what does change things doesn't seem to be politics and government so much. It does seem to be money. Because it's even worse than what you said. It's not just one country telling another country what it can do with, say, its own legal gambling. It's a state of the United States sometimes telling countries. And Nevada used to have a law that required the state of Nevada to investigate any government that was planning that had legalized casinos if one of the Nevada licensed operators was going there. I actually have a copy of the state of Nevada's report on New Jersey before Atlantic City opened up, and Nevada decided that New Jersey was doing a good job, and it was pretty funny. But what happened is, when Nevada casinos wanted to get into the Bahamas, the government of the Bahamas said, "We're a country. Why is this state telling us whether we're good enough for its licensees?" And so the government, there was some government influence there. And it turned out the ambassador to the Bahamas had come from Nevada, had ties, some influence. But what really changed it was, and Macau was one of the markets that opened up, and the Nevada licensed casinos said, this is taking too long. To have the state of Nevada look at whether another country is doing a good job means while you're doing the study, our competitors who are not licensed by the state of Nevada are going in there and getting the licenses. And there just became too much gambling around the world anyway. They couldn't study every province and jurisdiction, every country. I don't see much happening on a global basis. There's an International Association of Gaming Regulators that meets every year, and it's taken them decades to get some just standardized forms. And it's still, most places don't accept, you still have a lot of extra forms you have to fill out if you're going to be licensed. I remember talking to the head of one of the big manufacturers of slot machines who said his local police department didn't think it was so funny when he came in for the 30th time to be fingerprinted. And the problem is you can't get even states to agree, let alone countries. And then the reality is the United States doesn't particularly have, I was going to use the word respect, a softer word. The United States doesn't feel it has to change its laws in any way based on what's happening in the rest of the world. And the best example of that is the World Trade Organization. The Antigua filed a formal complaint against the United States, first time ever that a small country took on a big country. And the issue was that the United States allowed some internet gambling within its borders, but wouldn't allow the licensed gambling operations, internet gambling operations from Antigua to take bets from the United States. Antigua won. And the United States was, in effect, ordered that they had to open the borders. Their reaction was to simply change the treaty, to say, we're not going to do that. I did a search, and the only mention in the United States Congress of the World Trade Organization opinion was one guy got up and said, there's this group out there called the World Trade Organization that wants us to change our laws. I want to introduce a bill that the United States should never change its laws based on what anyone anywhere else in the world says. That was literally the only time Congress even looked at the issue, even though the World Trade Organization ordered it to change its laws. And they said, the reaction from the United States is, no, we're not even, not that we're not going to do that, we're not even going to pay any attention to that. So I don't see the U.S. right now saying that they're going to do anything. And I'll give you an example directly about Macau. When I testified in front of this commission, the U.S.-China Commission, and I said, look, one of the problems that Macau has is that gambling debts are not legally collectible on the mainland. And the commissioners, who were all, very high-placed Americans, and they said, well, that's terrible. China should change its laws. And then I said, well, gambling debts aren't collectible in the United States either. I mean, before we go telling China to change the laws, how can we go tell them to change our laws? We have the same law. And the final report kind of ignored that part and only said China should change its laws. That's kind of typical American.
Thank you. I could also have a quick shot at the question posed by Dr. Rui Cunha. In fact, in gaming law, it's very difficult to have international standards. In my presentation, I only talked about international standards, hard law, standards in the field of money laundering. There are conventions which spell out clearly requirements for customer identification, record keeping, reporting of transactions. The other area where there is a broad international agreement, but it's a murky field, is suitability. Much of what we've been talking about is technically about the suitability requirement, which is a relatively vague area of the law. One jurisdiction can be more demanding than the other, and it's difficult. I guess that's why it's very interesting to have academic research on the field, on the issue of suitability. How exactly is this requirement applied, although it's difficult to research inherently, to get to the information, to the analysis. suitability is really the crucial point, because one jurisdiction is kind of saying to the others, I have stronger suitability requirements than you, and it's difficult to compare, and it's difficult to know exactly. The rest is really domestic, whether there's one operator or two or three, or it's unlimited, whether it's a concession or a license, whether people have to pay or show an ID card, and all the other list of issues that I've gone through. Most of these things are totally domestic, and at the core of it, it's the most domestic issue of them all. Taxation.
Yeah.
Taxation. There will never be agreements in relation to taxation. So suitability is really the murky area. I guess for our students, we need more research into this area, I guess.
So I want to thank you again, and if anybody has any questions, we'll be around for a while.
Okay.
Right? Thank you.
Thank you very much.